sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for.
When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth.
In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Welcome back, folks. Another episode of the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. Dad, how's it going?
It's great. It's good to be here. Hi, everybody. We are back, and we are excited about another episode.
We got a pretty special episode for you this time around, and I would like to introduce to you our guest today, Mr. Scott Ummel, and you may recognize that last name because we did have another Ummel on the podcast at one point. But Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be here.
Scott, do you know the other Ummel? We had a guy here named Eric. Do you know him?
Absolutely. My older brother.
All in the family, man. All in the family. This is awesome.
It's. I hope it doesn't hurt your feelings that we had your brother on before we had you on, even though that you're one of our colleagues.
It doesn't hurt my feelings. I noticed that you said this is a special podcast. So I'm assuming it wasn't a special podcast when he was.
Well, you can define special a lot of different ways, Scott, but I hope you do as good as he did, because he did really well.
He did. I was really proud of him.
So before we get going on this show, I want to first ask you two, how do you know each other? You guys go a long ways back. Is that right?
Yeah, we're currently, of course, we're colleagues. Scott is one of the consultants on the Nash Consulting team, and Scott, how long you been with us?
A little over 6 years.
6 years, yeah. And folks, Scott has been rocking it. He is an extraordinary consultant and coach, and does amazing work. But we met. How old were we when we met, Scott? I don't remember ages or dates.
I think it was back in the early 80s. Actually, high school youth group. And, we didn't know each other that well. You were a grade ahead of me. So, we didn't really connect that much in that time, but we knew who each other were.
Yeah, and we ended up going to a summer camp together, or some kind of a camp. We got to know each other, and boy, the rest was history, man. We did some motorcycle riding, and we painted my dad's house, and we had lots of fun. And
actually, could I correct you on that?
Yeah, please do, because I'm sure you will. Yes.
You didn't actually do motorcycle riding. I rode on the back of your motorcycle.
That's true. That's what it was. Yeah. Well, we had some fun though. Those were good times.
And then I remember your dad. Yeah, we actually painted your dad's house.
Oh man, we did the worst job, Scott. Do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, we'd never painted a house before.
I remember I got paid $100. I couldn't believe it. I think we tried for maybe one day, and then we just kind of abandoned it.
We literally quit. We were painting the house, and we had no idea that painting a house was so much work, and we didn't know how to do it, and we were getting paint on the windows, and it just looked crappy. And we're like, and I remember telling my dad, we're done. It was one day, and we just quit. And I think he gave us $200, and he probably had to hire someone to come in and fix our mistakes.
Well, old friends with old stories. So I know you two ended up then connecting, later in life, in which around that time Scott got involved with coaching and consulting work with you. How did you come back into each other's orbits?
Well, so Mike, we didn't know each other that well in high school, and we kind of connected that summer that we went to college. And really, we were kind of best friends for about 3 weeks.
Yep.
And then we just lost, I went to Western, you went to a different college, and we lost connection after that. But one of the things, and I know my brother brought this up on the previous podcast, is that you're just an amazing piano player. And that's one of the things that I remembered about you, even in junior high. And so I was listening to piano one day about 15 years ago, and I was like, God, I wonder what Mike's up to. I haven't talked to him in a long time, and it just brought back these really great memories. So I did a Google search, and Mike kind of looked you up again, and then we started having, dinner probably every couple of weeks
At
for,
the Bahama Breeze in South
yeah,
Center.
that's right, Bahama Breeze. And so I would share some things that were going on in my professional career, and we'd talk about life stuff and just really reconnected. So
Yeah, and what was interesting was Scott would be telling me all about his job. But quick note here, Scott, what was your job at that time? What was your role?
I was a director of customer operations.
Yeah, so Scott was an executive, and he would just tell me all these amazing interventions he was doing and how he was working with his employees and the heart he had for his people and the wisdom I was hearing from him. And he was just even as an executive, he was also acting as a coach and a consultant. And I just thought, man, this guy, he could do this work. And he actually has exceeded my expectations. Scott, you're just really, really good at this work.
Thanks so much.
We've asked you here, Scott, to talk about your specialty, actually, which is 1970s television shows. And so our episode is going to be about, so like, for example, Potsy, do you have a quote from Potsy from Happy Days, or maybe something from Billy Bob John, whatever that guy's name is on the Waltons? Or
putting me on the spot. I wish I were Potsy.
That's right. You don't need a quote.
I can't give. I'm just, the first thing that came to mind was when he sang "Put Your Head on My Shoulder" to Joni when she had a crush on him. So.
Oh yes, that classic episode.
Yes, absolutely.
Scott is an amazing memory, and he just is always surprising us with the trivia he happens to know about television shows from the 80s or 70s. Sorry. But yeah, real though. Hey, Scott has spent a bunch of time reading and researching and taking courses, and social neuroscience, I guess, would be the umbrella term. Scott, tell us a little bit about what you've been learning and why, and et cetera.
Yeah, so really it started out a couple of years ago reading a book by Daniel Friedland, Leading Well from Within. It's a great book. I know that all three of us have read that. And he just mentioned something from the Neuro Leadership Institute, a model called S.C.A.R.F. And just a little bit that he talked about that, it just really piqued my interest. And then I ended up taking the Neuro Leadership course. It was a 20-week course, and really expanded on the S.C.A.R.F model, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. And so I hope to share some things. I've been able to actually share the model with over 50 groups this last year, and just had some great discussions.
Scott, you've gotten great reviews, and the groups that you've worked with in teaching on S.C.A.R.F and neuroscience they've been enthralled, and it's helped them become better managers. And others on the team now have taken up the mantle, and we begin teaching the same things. And I'm excited to have you here. So I guess just tell us, what have you learned? What's the bottom line here? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, and I just really wanted to quickly, we talked about the Neuro Leadership Institute that I went through 20 weeks of training, and Dr. David Rock actually created the S.C.A.R.F model, and he spent about 2 years on researching a book, and he was hearing things from neuroscientists, same patterns over and over again. And so that's how he created these 5 domains that we're going to talk about. All right, so just to make it as concise as possible, S.C.A.R.F is a brain-based model for collaboration that describes 5 domains of social experience. And it's driven by the desire to minimize threat, maximize reward. One of the things that you'll hear over and over again is that an organizing principle in the brain is that everything is a threat or a reward. We're constantly either moving towards things or away from things based on threats or rewards. So this model really gives us some guidance on how we can sort of engage in those positive approach emotions.
So threat and reward, say something about that. Why are we doing that all the time? Why are we always running from threat, going toward reward? What's that about? Where'd that come from?
Yeah, it goes back to really kind of our tribal days too, and a lot of this research is how we're hardwired. We're highly attuned to threats, and so it's the reason that we've survived. And really, I'd like to just talk about how we kind of process information. A lot of this is happening at the unconscious level. So I wanted to just talk for a couple of minutes on how we process information. There's a really great book called Your Body Keeps the Score. And the author describes how we process information just at lightning speed, really at an unconscious level. So it talks about information from the outside world arriving through our senses, our eyes, our nose, our ears, our skin. And it comes through in about 1/5 of a second and integrates into this part of our brain called the thalamus. And the thalamus integrates all of this sensory information and sort of organizes it and shoots it down on what he calls the low road, or the fast track to the amygdala. And the amygdala is a structure in our midbrain, our emotional brain. Also heard of it called the limbic system. And it shoots it down quickly, and it's doing a pattern match for things that might be dangerous. In fact, this author calls the amygdala the smoke detector for danger.
Wow.
So it's doing this pattern match, and the amygdala's primary purpose is to identify whether this incoming input is relevant to our survival. So it's looking out for things that are dangerous in our environment. And that's one of the reasons that we've survived. He refers to it as the smoke detector for danger. He gives this example of, is the smoke that the amygdala is sensing is your house burning down and you need to get out quickly? Or is it from a steak that you put on too high a flame? The amygdala doesn't.
So it's like immediately your amygdala's, without your prefrontal cortex getting involved at all, your amygdala is basically deciding, I better get the heck out of here, or this is safe.
Exactly. And this is really happening at an unconscious level. And if it's too much of a threat, it can move our body into kind of this fight or flight response. And when you just ask that question about threat, we're just highly attuned to threats. And another thing that I read the other day is that positive emotions or good things aren't, there's no survival payoff, right? The reason that we've survived is that we've been really highly attuned to dangerous things in the environment.
I just read recently
Yeah.
that our ancestors who sat around and tried to get to know themselves and tune into the universe and feel good, they got eaten by saber-toothed tigers, right? They weren't doing what they needed to do to survive. So that part of our we didn't evolve to feel good, actually.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's happening so quickly. And what happens next is it moves on a slower track, or what he calls the high road, to our prefrontal cortex, which he calls kind of the watchtower. And that's where, in fact, the way it's been described, in the neuroleadership training, there was Dr. Amy Arnston, a senior neuroscientist at Yale. And she talks about our prefrontal cortex that thoughtfully guides our actions, our emotions, our attention. So this part of our brain can actually control that fear response. It's also the place where we make good decisions. It's the place where we generate insight.
Wow. So what you're talking about here with the brain is really just its knack to minimize threat, like you said, and maximize rewards. Now, what is this S.C.A.R.F acronym? Like what is the kind of the overview of what S.C.A.R.F is, what each letter means, and I'll let you run with that.
Yeah. So I'll give you a brief overview of that. And really kind of the punchline here is that the emotional brain that I just described, the author talks about that having first dibs on information from the environment. So when information is coming through our senses, it's coming to the emotional brain, the survival brain. And if we're stuck in our survival brain during our workday, we're not going to be at our best. Really, where we want to be is in that prefrontal cortex, that place where we can make good decisions, where we can have judgment, discernment, and can really control that fear response. So, Ethan, in answer to your question, the S.C.A.R.F model really helps sort of get us out of that reflexive part of our brain, that default sort of negative emotional part of our brain where we can experience these threats, to the reflective part of our brain, to that rational part of our brain. And so the S.C.A.R.F model really gives us some ideas on how to stay in that prefrontal cortex, that other part of our brain. Problem is, and one of the things that Dr. David Rock talks about, is that there's an overlap in brain regions controlling our survival and social needs. So a lot of times our emotional brain is interpreting social situations that actually kick us into the fight or flight.
Yeah, and what's happened, of course, is we're still using all those reactions, like you said, in social settings where we don't really need it anymore in that setting, right? But we're still doing fight, flight, or freeze in the middle of a meeting, or when we're trying to collaborate, or when we are getting feedback and it's getting in our way, right? We're in our own way of our success.
Yeah.
And it's so fun to talk about this because we can talk about how to help ourselves and our employees to not be in threat, mode, but to be in, either neutral or reward mode, right?
Absolutely. I think that just the awareness of these domains actually gives us some guidance.
So then, yeah, let's go through each letter of this acronym S.C.A.R.F.
Yeah, absolutely. So S.C.A.R.F, the acronym, the first letter S is for status. And status is really your brain tracking your level of importance in a community. It's about pecking order. It's about seniority. And it's about a feeling of being a less than. If we feel less than, that can generate a strong threat. Certainty is the C. And the one of the things you'll hear in the S.C.A.R.F journal or read in there is that our brains are pattern recognition machines trying to predict the future. Ambiguity and uncertainty can generate a strong threat response. The A is for autonomy. Autonomy is the perception of exerting control over your environment. It's the sensation of having choices. R is relatedness. And relatedness is a sense of inclusion. Being disconnected from our tribe or our team can generate a strong threat response. And then the last one is fairness. And, a sense of fairness is hardwired into our brain. When we're being treated unfairly, that can generate a strong threat response.
So is it safe to say, Scott, that those 5 things we are unconsciously constantly looking for reward in those 5 areas and also constantly trying to avoid threat?
Yes. And I would say the latter, Mike, what you just say, trying to avoid threat. One of the things is that the threat response is so much stronger than the approach response or the reward. For the reward response, we have to be intentional. The threat response is just kind of our default mode.
Yeah, and that seems to, at least what I can tell, seems to map on to other different types of, cognitive biases. We have a, negativity bias. We act a lot stronger to negativity, and we're incentivized a lot more by loss than we are by gain. And that kind of seems to map onto what you're saying right here.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that reminds me of somebody said that the amygdala is Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good experience.
That makes sense. I look at my own life and I totally relate to that. Like I'll be at a gathering, I'll be hanging out with people, and I'll have a good time, and I'll say one stupid thing, that one thing, right? And then driving home, it's like I'm not even thinking about the fun I had and all the good stuff. I'm thinking about
Right.
the one stupid thing, right?
Right.
That's that negativity bias there.
Yeah, exactly. And I was also thinking about just even when we're doing all day training, everything's going along really well. You have great small group discussions. People are coming up at breaks. And then you can shuffle through your evaluations and it's like, wow, this is great. This is awesome. And then one person says, instructor needs to pick up the pace, right? And so, yeah, I'm thinking about that all weekend. I'm not thinking about all the things that went well. So
I
tend to
suck. I
ruminate.
suck.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Let's get into these, Scott. Let's go through S.C.A.R.F a little bit more. Talk about, you know, a little deeper into what the researchers have found to be true about each of these domains.
Yeah, you know, okay, the first thing, the status threat, and I thought I would just kind of share some things from the S.C.A.R.F journal itself. Um, it, one of the things it says, many everyday conversations devolve into arguments driven by a status threat, the desire to not be perceived as less than another. So this feeling of being less than is kind of this constant threat out there. And it goes on to say, they really, one of the things in the S.C.A.R.F model, what you read is that they've done experiments for these social situations. And one of the things they say is, the question, can I offer you some feedback, in most people generates the same response as fast footsteps walking behind somebody at night. And that's pretty powerful. I mean, that's a fight or flight emotion. Mike, I think I've heard you say is it's like we're being emotionally mugged, right?
Yeah, yeah, I'm
So,
about to be. Yeah, if
yeah,
you have some feedback for me, my brain at that moment cannot tell the difference between social danger and physical danger, right? So my brain's going to do the exact same thing in those first, you know, what you said, like fifth of a second. Same thing as if somebody was about to mug me, right? So we
right.
get activated, we get defensive, and we can't even help it. Like you said, it's unconscious. It just happens.
Right, right. And it's really impossible. One of the things that we talk about in our leadership training, even on the first day, is it's impossible not to feel defensive. So part of this isn't about, you know, really working to not feel defensive. That's going to be there. But what can we do, not only personally, but also as leaders, to sort of turn this threat around into a reward?
I really like what you said right there with, you know, this isn't, we're going to feel it no matter what. So this isn't about some sort of, you know, voodoo that makes us not, well, it makes our brain not work how it's supposed to, right? It's like, I don't want to feel defensiveness anymore. We're going to feel it. It's just about how we relate to it, how we respond to it. And I've heard it say before, you know, with quote unquote negative emotions that come up, it's almost like you take them and you say, oh, thank you for trying to protect me here. Like, I don't
Right.
necessarily need this right now, but thank you for doing your job.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to, you know, again, in the first couple of hours of the first day of our leadership training, we talk about some of the things that we can do, just the internal mindset that we can practice. And one of the first thing is, don't beat yourself up, right? When you're going to be receiving feedback, or you are, maybe you're getting some constructive feedback, if we beat ourselves up, if we attack ourselves, really kind of, we can generate our own fight or flight, right? So show yourself some self-compassion, just as you would a good friend.
That's good. Yeah. And when I'm, you know, my amygdala is telling me I'm in danger because you've just criticized me. So I've got the defensiveness going on, right? As we develop emotional IQ, we can now look at the sense that, you know, we can look at what we're feeling. Like Ethan said, hey, welcome, you know, this is what I'm feeling. Like you said, we can give ourselves some self-compassion. We can make different choices. I think I'm going to respond carefully at this point. I'm not going to show my defensiveness.
Right, right, absolutely. You know, another thing, and I know we just have limited time, not to get into too much detail, but just to be open, right? Challenge the way you see. If we can get into a state of curiosity, As we've all talked about before, it's impossible, really, almost impossible for curiosity and defensiveness to sort of exist together.
So status is this thing our brain is looking for, that looking to make sure we're not feeling less than, or is alerting us if we happen to be feeling less than. And this shows up in the workplace in situations like, I need to give you feedback. That gets interpreted as, oh, I'm less than this person that has to now give me feedback. And obviously it could show up in a lot of other ways. There was one, they've done some interesting studies with chimpanzees. In fact, they found that, the chimpanzees with the lower status in the group, right? You would think, oh, okay, well, maybe that means they have less responsibility, so they'll be less stressed out. Well, they actually found the ones with lower status had higher cortisone levels, right? Which is the stress levels. And actually that same thing has been mirrored in large organizations. You would think the executives at the very top, they might be the most stressed out. They have the most pressure on them, but it's actually those at the lower level that are feeling that stress response, that cortisol levels are higher. Now, to me, I read that as, well, it's a status thing, and our status is threatened, and therefore our brain is responding to that by, reacting.
Yeah, absolutely, Ethan. And even thinking back to our tribal days, what happens if our status was reduced, right? If our status was threatened in our tribe?
Certain death.
Yeah, I mean, they either left you behind. In that book *Sapiens*, it talks about they interviewed this hunter-gatherer, was the last known hunter-gatherer tribe in Paraguay, and then they integrated back into society. And he said, and this person said, look, we just either killed people or we left them behind if they weren't of value. So,
as one does, right?
Yes, right.
I've also noticed in my experience that when I give negative feedback to chimpanzees, they get really defensive.
Well, yeah.
Hey, I know we need to move on, but another thing I realized, I remember this, a threat to status would be, hey, I'm going to ask people's opinion before I make a decision, but I'm not going to ask you, Scott. I skip you, right? I ask everybody else. Right? Would that be another sign, another time where I might be thinking, oh my gosh, I don't measure up. I'm not important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, not only asking for feedback, if I feel left out, right, that's going to generate a status threat. I think also, just to kind of close the loop on that, I'm asking for feedback. What am I doing with that feedback, right? Am I actually sort of, following up on it or actually absorbing it?
So I would feel like my status is threatened if I've given you feedback and you ignore it.
Right.
Yes,
right.
Good. And you can reward me in the status domain by asking for my feedback and then doing something with my feedback.
Right. Hey, here's another thing. I mean, we've talked about feedback. This is really about sort of the opposite too, just giving positive feedback. That's so important. And just to kind of, that we talk about that relational bank account, right? We need to give genuine positive feedback. And that actually activates, we have these less than brain regions and that are activated. We also have better than, or we feel better than. So.
Right. That brings up, something I read in the S.C.A.R.F paper by David Rock as I was doing my homework for this conversation. It touches on, I think, exactly what you're talking about. The quote is, knowing the drivers that can cause a threat response enables people to design interactions to minimize threats. And then he also goes on to say, knowing about the drivers that can activate a reward response enables people to motivate others more effectively by tapping into internal rewards. And he goes on. So is that kind of what you're saying here? Is there's two ends to the spectrum. There's knowing how to engineer your interactions so you're not creating a threat response, but also knowing this model can positively influence those responses as well.
Yeah, maximize reward. Yeah, that's management, right? That's why we teach this to managers. Is exactly what you just said. Is we can help managers design their interactions to minimize threat and maximize reward in their employees. It's awesome, dude. Let's move on. You want to C is certainty, right?
Yeah, C is certainty. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. We're always trying to predict what's going to happen in the near future. So ambiguity and uncertainty can create this strong threat response. I think the first thing, just from a work standpoint, is when we're uncertain about things, we tend to fill in the gaps. We're going to fight for certainty. Our brains are constantly trying to fill in the gaps. So if we're and because we have this negativity bias, we're typically going to fill it in with things that might be dangerous, right? So, Mike, if I leave you a voicemail and I don't hear back from you, and I say, hey, let's get together, or let's catch up, and so a day later, I'm thinking, I wonder why he didn't give me a call back. Then maybe another day goes by. Oh, last time I saw him, we talked about this thing. We start building up this story in our mind. I wonder if he's pissed off at me, right? And so we kind of build up this story.
And in reality, it's just I don't like you. I don't.
Right. Exactly.
No, that's exactly right. I think in class we talk about that old Native American proverb: "If you give me a blank, I'll fill it in with demons." Yes, right. And again, when I don't know what's going on, when I'm uncertain, I don't go to my happy place, right? We go someplace else. We make stuff up. We tell stories. We get paranoid. And so when our employees are left in the dark, or they don't know what's happening, do we blame them for for getting upset or getting negative or getting afraid? And then of course, when our employees are afraid, they're not engaged. They're not creative. They're not collaborating.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing with going back again to sort of our instincts, if something was rustling in the bushes, we didn't necessarily jump to it's a cute little mouse. It might be a lion. I mean, that's why we survived. And so in the workplace, if we're trying to fill in the gaps, we're not going to necessarily insert something positive.
Right. Yeah. Those have been described as, different type 1 errors or type 2 errors, right? We happen to make these type 1 errors, which is this false positive, right? Which is, you saw the rustle in the grass was a dangerous predator. Turned out it was just wind, but guess what? Not much cost for this error.
Right.
The other error, there's wind, there's rustle in the grass, it's just wind, no big deal. Turns out it's a predator and it just kills you. So that's a bigger cost to that error. So we evolved to be more fearful and make these type 1 errors.
Yes.
And the more we leave our employees in the dark, the more they're going to make the type. I get those backwards, Ethan.
They make the type 1 error. They make
type
these
1
false
error.
Positives.
That's exactly okay. So there's really not that much danger. But they're acting as if there is, right? So they're triggered. They're not engaged. So certainty. We're certainty machines. Scott, did you already mention the printer light?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Yeah, throw that in there. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
So in the S.C.A.R.F paper, it talks about the fact that ambiguity, our brains it forces attention away from our goals, and it goes to this part of our brain they call that's called the orbital frontal cortex, and it just fires up this error message. And they use this analogy. It's kind of like that jammed printer when that blinking light. Until we fix that, we can't really focus any attention on our goals. So.
That's really interesting.
In fact, it was interesting. I just had a conversation just a few weeks ago with a client. We were going through the S.C.A.R.F model, and he's talking about certainty and uncertainty, especially right now. And he remembered back. He said his check engine light went on when he was driving over the pass one time, and his fiance was trying to talk about wedding plans. He was just like, I can't think about that right now. I'm kind of worried about what's going to happen. So check engine like was a good analogy.
That's
Nice.
great. Yeah. So I guess we're rewarding our employees then by generously sharing information, by asking them what they want to know, by clear expectations so they know what to expect, consistency, lots of great things we can do as managers to meet that need and to help avoid the threat response.
Absolutely. And just one other thing, Mike, with that, I think that um, not making assumptions is just a really important part of just, it's so difficult not to sort of fill in those gaps, but if we can just step back and just give ourselves a little bit of space. And then I think even if we want to stretch that a little bit, how about even assign good intentions, right? And not
Nice.
to get into somebody's motives or intentions because those are typically wrong.
Oh, good.
Nice. Now, does this certainty piece, I mean, we've had an episode and we've spoken a lot about the power differential and how that plays in, you know, without getting too much into the weeds on this one. I'm sure we'll have some follow-up episodes where we can talk more about, you know, how this applies directly to management principles. But, you know, you're in an organization and there's somebody with power over you, right? Their status is higher than you. Could that trigger a certainty response in some way of just not being certain how this person in charge is going to react to certain situations? Or what do you think about that?
I think that's a really great point, Ethan. And one of the things that this actually brings up is the S.C.A.R.F multiplier. When we have these domains that sort of play off of each other or they blend together, the threat becomes exponential. And even the one that you just brought up, now I have somebody in authority, right, who maybe they're inconsistent, maybe they show up, they're emotionally inconsistent. Which boss is showing up today? So not only I'm not certain about this, how somebody's going to show up, but how are they going to react? Are they going to overreact? So there can be a status threat and a certainty threat that combine.
Ah, man, I wish my boss could hear this episode.
Yeah, right, right.
Good one, Ethan.
Well, think about this. That's actually kind of a triple whammy because then my autonomy, which is the next thing we'll talk about, can also be threatened as well. Maybe the boss is a micromanager and inconsistent, right? So now you have a triple whammy.
Oh boy. Well, yeah, let's back up to just remind everybody where we're at. We're going through this acronym S.C.A.R.F. We talked about status, we talked about certainty, and Scott, tell us about autonomy.
Okay, that sounds good. Fact, I just ran across something this last week that I wanted to read. Daniel Goleman, Hannah, another consultant, and I are kind of going through his emotional intelligence course online, and he says self-awareness. So this S.C.A.R.F model just gives us a glimpse into having more self-awareness on these threats and rewards. But it says self-awareness might be our most important tool for gaining access to our autonomy, our ability to influence our choices rather than go through life blindly. So I just thought that was a really, really great quote.
Wow.
Um,
Influence
and
our choices. I like that.
yeah. So autonomy is just a lot about choices, about the sensation of having choices, the perception of having choices.
Boy, that just immediately, I just think of, again, employees and managers and, you know, how often are we hearing, hey, I'm being micromanaged, or, you know, and it's a really tricky balance in the workplace. But I just think that there's always ways to help our employees find more empowerment and the ability to make choices and their opinions count, and, you know, et cetera.
Right. You know, it's interesting. We talk about this S.C.A.R.F multiplier. The power differential is so important. Part of our conversation for each domain so far has been, the micromanaging is just really that number one thing that we hear in our trainings that can exaggerate that power differential, where I, as a leader, am not approachable, if I'm micromanaging. Yeah, and one of the other things that I hear from autonomy standpoint is, well, in fact, I'll read something from the S.C.A.R.F paper itself. It says sound policy establishes the boundaries within which individuals can exercise creativity and autonomy. It allows for point of need decision making and hardwires autonomy into the processes of an organization. So just having sound policy, what are my expectations, clear role clarity, task clarity, just so people have boundaries to work within.
It's actually counterintuitive because we find in organizations, if there's clear expectations,
Mm,
I don't, if I've given my employees clear expectations, I don't actually have to micromanage them anymore.
right,
Right. So
right.
the more they know what's happening. So go back to certainty, right? The more freedom of control and freedom of
Mm.
choice I can have.
Yeah, it is a little bit counterintuitive. And I think the other thing, having an influence and outcome. Um, One of the things that I notice when I go back to organizations in year 2 and sometimes in year 3, we ask what's going well, what could be going better. And Mike, I don't know about you, but almost always our decision-making model is just in that top. That's something that's going well.
Yep.
So we just being able to have an influence in the decision-making process is really, really important.
Boy, that's great. Yep.
Scott, I got a quick question for you. This may be a
Mm-hmm.
bit of a digression, so I
That's okay.
apologize in advance. But as we're going through this, I'm thinking to myself, are these, is this SCARF, right? The status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, are these equal to each individual? Like do some of them seem to or do people seem to react stronger to certain threats over others? And is it different between person to person?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, Ethan, once again, because uh, we have a SCARF order. There are things that certain domains are going to have a greater impact from a threat and reward level on some people over than others. So, Mike, I know you and I have even talked about that, right?
Right.
Just in the past, just in conversation. I know that certainty really um, seems to be in the forefront for me. That would probably
Hmm.
be in my own SCARF order, something that I would put at the top. And you know me, you know my personality. Even if you send me a text that says, "Hey, do you have time to talk this afternoon?" What's a typical response that you would get from me?
Is everything okay?
Yeah, right, right.
Right.
So like, what's the matter?
Yeah.
You'd be
What's the
like,
matter? Yeah. Right.
I
Right.
just
Right.
want to, find out when we can have dinner next.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Exactly.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. And you're
Yeah.
like, why do you ask me that question?
Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah, I
And
think
for,
mine's
yeah,
autonomy, and I'm glad you said that because I remember asking a couple different groups to rank order these, to Ethan's question, right? Like, here's the 5 domains, let's learn about them. Okay, now let's go ahead and rank order them. Which one is the most produces the most frequent threats for you, all the way down to the one that you don't even really notice that much, and it's just all across the board. I just think everyone is so different.
Yeah. And it could also just be a result, both, internally, how, whether nurture or nature, how you respond uh, to these different threats, but it's also probably a result of the environment you're in, like especially the work environment you're in. If you're in a work environment where there's no autonomy, you're probably noticing that
right.
autonomy cord is getting strung a lot more, I would imagine. Because for me, I think the one that ranks highest for me, I guess, or the one that I see myself reacting to the strongest is probably that status one. And I noticed that I had worked in a previous work environment. I noticed that status one was just always getting rung. And I realized it was a combination both of the environment I was in, and this one just happens to rank higher to me. I react stronger to that one. So I don't know, just a realization I'm having here on the spot as you're explaining this, Scott.
Ethan, research says that the parent has a lot to do with that. So no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's I like to just blame it all on my parents.
I'll take
That's
it.
my
Right.
go-to.
I'll take it, guys. I'll take it. So let's move on. Let's talk
Hey,
about
hey,
sorry, Scott, go ahead.
can I just insert one
Yeah, yeah.
thing, Ethan? That's such a
Please.
great point. And I think that one of the things is not only to be aware of our own sort of SCARF order, but kind of an advanced thing is as leaders, how about our team, right? What's the SCARF order in our team?
Mm.
What are some of the triggers and some things that really resonate with? our team members.
Great. Yeah, that's
Good.
super important.
So yeah, so R, Scott, relatedness. Let's tell us about that.
All right, so relatedness. Relatedness is the sense of being connected, right, to our tribe. It's a sense of inclusion. If we felt disconnected from our tribe, that might be a life or death thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I loved it. My analogy for this one is, I want to be in the circle of people around the campfire. I don't want to be outside the circle. Not only, based on eons of evolution, does that probably mean I'm going to die, right? But currently it hurts, right? In fact, Scott, there's connection here to actual physical pain. Tell us about that.
Yeah. In fact, gosh, I'm glad you brought that up too. And I just really wanted to say that that the relatedness, just finishing that out, it's about friend or foe, in group or out group, trust or distrust. Relatedness is strongly linked to trust. So the brain networks that light up, one of the things that they notice in these S.C.A.R.F domains is that the physical pain networks light up on certain threats. So when we're experiencing the social pain, the physical pain networks are lighting up. And one of the experiments that they did was this game of digital ball, where they have three people throwing they're in this brain scan situation, but while they're waiting, they're playing this game where they're throwing this ball back and forth. And then they systematically remove someone from being able to have the ball thrown to them. And they look at the brain networks that light up, and these are actual physical pain networks that are inflamed for this person. So they say when they say social rejection hurts, it's really true.
Well, they found that if you give someone Tylenol, they actually feel less rejection. Isn't that crazy?
Right. That was the kind of the crazy part of the experiment, is that they gave the participants who experienced this social rejection or this inflammation in the pain networks, it reduced the inflammation. So we're not suggesting for leaders to give Tylenol to their teams. But
before they reject them, here's some Tylenol.
You might be able to just give them candy and tell them it's going to make them feel better, and it could work as well. So
placebo. Yeah, there you go.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things with relatedness, and it's interesting having sort of small group discussions on this. This is really kind of a social connection, right? It's about these neuroscientists from all over the world are now just really encouraging just that social connection in work groups, and it's about safety. It really comes back to feeling safe. One of the things that I thought about this week from a relatedness standpoint is a training that I was in a couple of years ago, and it was one of those trainings where the people from at a utility. These are field service workers. They didn't want to be there. We were going to be talking about things like giving and receiving feedback and appreciation and things like that. And so immediately, people are like, why are we here? How long is this going to last? What are we going to be talking about? And so as we were doing these introductions, there were some sarcastic remarks, and this one guy said, I don't want to be here. If I knew that we were going to be talking about this stuff today, I wouldn't have come. So people were laughing and things, and so it was going to be a long day.
It was like a terrible beginning of a training, man.
It was like 8:35, and already these comments were coming out. I was already looking at the clock. And what was interesting at the break, then he and I, this person, would kind of have this uncomfortable bump. We bumped into each other just going to the bathroom or something. And so we're face to face, and he says, oh, hey, yeah, sorry about, some of those comments, but, it's really frustrating having to be here today. I said, yeah, I totally understand. And I said, appreciate your honesty. And So anyways, just really quickly, we talked about, I said, where are you commuting from? And so he talks about, oh, up north in kind of the Mukilteo area. I said, oh, okay, you know what? That's where my girls went to school in the school district. And we just found in about 2 minutes this connection. And just some of these things in common. And when we came back out to the group, somebody else said something kind of sarcastic, and he stood up and he just said, "Hey, can we just let the man talk?" Something like this. And he was actually just throughout that day, just starting to participate. He stayed after the training a little bit. But what I've noticed is just that little bit of social connection, just that little bit of common ground, knowing something about somebody can really help with relationship.
That's a great story. Great example.
Yeah. It's interesting coming from kind of a sales background. I've often heard from people that kind of poo-poo small talk in a way, like, no time for that. Let's just get down to business. Let's just do things. And, it just seems kind of fluffy, right? This small talk. But then, when you put it through the lens of kind of the brain and our different needs and reactions, creating, having that small talk and just finding some common ground, like you said, will actually allow you to just have better conversations, more authentic conversations. So I don't know, just a realization I'm having right now of like, there's a purpose for that small talk, and that's to see where you two connect.
It's the same with, that's so good, Ethan. It's the same with team building, right? I've worked with managers who say, I don't believe in team building, right? We don't have time for this. It's not important. And invariably, when you check in with their people, these are not people with high morale. These are not people who feel connected. Yeah. And so absolutely.
Yeah, really. One more thing on that. That's, both of those are really great points. There's a Google study that what made a productive team. And so they spent all this money and research and time on, is it people that have with higher IQs, or is it introverts, extroverts, and it was really elusive. They couldn't figure out what made a productive team. And they finally discovered this psychological safety. Do I feel safe? Are there safe social interactions? And there's a really good New York Times article on this. But Mike, it just reminded me this guy that was a participant, this Google leader, that he thought that the morale on his team was really great, and he got this feedback back and the morale was low. So he had this team building kind of offsite thing, and he just shared some things about himself. He shared some of the health issues, and it kind of opened up for his team to share some personal things, and their morale just skyrocketed.
We need to move on to
okay.
F stands for fairness.
Among many things.
Yes. So right. So fairness was really interesting. Again, when they did the study of these domains, sort of these experiments, some of the brain regions that lit up when somebody felt like they were being treated fairly, they were primary rewards like food, chocolate, pleasant memory, pleasant touch, all of these really great sort of feel-good brain networks that are lighting up when people feel like they're being treated fairly. And on the flip side, when people felt like they were being treated unfairly, the emotion, the place in our brain where we feel the emotion of disgust, that was one of the things that was the most common that lit up. So also another thing to come out of that is that we don't have access to, we can't feel empathy for other people when we're being treated unfairly. And,
really?
Yeah, we don't have access to the empathy networks in our brain.
So that's, now I might be going off here. Is that the sympathetic nervous system, right? When we're threatened, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in. So, and that renders us unable to, I think that's where we lose empathy, where we can't collaborate. We kind of get into self-protection mode. So we're not really thinking about others. We're thinking about ourselves.
Right. Yeah, I think we're just in that part of our brain where we experience those really intense emotions. You know, it's in there, it's in our survival brain. It's in the emotional brain.
Scott, what's that experiment? I forget what it's called, the game, you know, where they're dividing up money. Would you talk about that?
Oh yeah. So they did this, this thing, sort of this lab experiment. It's called the ultimatum game. So really basic, there's a giver of money and there's a receiver of money. So usually the receiver of money is this lab participant. And so the experimenter shows a picture of somebody, hey, this person can give you, we're going to give this person, let's say $100, and they can split it up with you any way they like. If you keep what they give you, then you both keep the money. If you reject their offer, neither one of you get any money. So they start out with this 50-50, hey, I got $50, that's fair. Goes 50-50, 60-40. When they got to the 80-20, people started rejecting offers. And it actually started, that's where they see these brain networks, the emotion of disgust. They could actually tell if somebody was rejecting an offer by the area of the brain that was lighting up.
So basically, if I reject the offer, I don't even get my $20.
Right, right.
But it feels good to make you not get your $80.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, there were reward centers in the brain that lit up when people actually rejected offer because they felt, hey, at least you're being punished. I feel good about that.
So people would rather have nothing than to be treated in a way that they feel unfair.
Yeah. And you know, the really ridiculous thing in this experiment is that they actually did it with computers too, where computers randomly generated offers. And they even told the person. And when it got to the 90-10, people were still rejecting offers. That's how strong unfairness, right?
I'm going to get that damn computer. He's
Yeah,
so...
right, right.
Oh boy.
So yeah, so in the workplace, right? I mean, we're basically talking about equity and fairness, and one of the things that kind of concerns me sometimes is when I hear managers talk like, you know, hey, this employee is complaining because, you know, that other employee is coming in late, right? And I, you know, and you hear managers kind of use language like, well, that's really not your business, and don't worry about it. And it's like, you know, what the employee's saying in a sense, of course, is, this is not fair, right? I'm coming in on time and this person's not, and we're both getting paid the same. And so you have to listen to what the employee is actually saying, right? They're talking about the domain of fairness at that point.
Right. Exactly. And that's, Mike, that's such a great point. I think that in the groups, again, I had about 50 groups in that exact scenario. Leaders would say, you know, they'd kind of retro back into the previous year and they'd say, man, I wish I would have been more proactive. Just kind of sharing, you know, the rationale or the why behind the what. It's a lot of what we hear is we know what the what is, we don't know the why. And if we don't know the why, we tend to fill in the gaps with something that most likely is unfair. That person got that project because, you know, he went to her wedding or something like that. Right? We start to sort of connect these dots that don't exist.
Nice. Well, this has been really helpful. Now, Scott, if you were to kind of, you know, put a bow on this whole topic of S.C.A.R.F here and sum it up for us, and then perhaps, you know, give our listeners some guidance of maybe how to take this and apply it in some way, you know, in the workplace or in everyday life.
Yeah, boy, that's a really good question, Ethan. I think that just even starting with the basics, just even writing down a one sentence basic description of what each domain is, and then just trying to have an awareness, how is this affecting me? And trying to have an awareness that one of the things that really can shift our brain activity from that emotional, reflexive, survival part of our brain is being aware of what's happening in the moment, right? Labeling that a moment. What am I feeling? is my reaction going to do me more harm than good? Right? That even labeling that emotion in the moment, I'm feeling a status threat, I'm feeling less than, I'm feeling criticized, that actually can move that brain activity to the prefrontal cortex just through that actual, sort of putting the feelings into words.
That's great.
Yeah, and we've talked about kind of this concept on this podcast before, and what I'm hearing is, you're advocating for a type of mental training, right? The same way we go run or go to the gym, we also need to train our brains in a certain way, and learning to pay attention to when these things arise and when we're reacting is a type of mental training. And I think we can all gain a lot from even just being aware of these different domains and then seeing how they might be applying to our lives or showing up in our lives.
Absolutely. And really, we can't afford to not be in the prefrontal cortex. We just can't. In the information age, it's exponentially important to be in that part of our brain. So
I love it.
This is great. So helpful. This is gold, I think, for personally and for managers. Beautiful. Thanks, Scott. This is so good.
Right. You bet.
Yeah. Well, Scott, we hope to have you back here soon for a part 2. I know we just kind of scraped the surface of this whole S.C.A.R.F thing, and there's so many more applications to this that we want to talk about. So, whether you want to or not, you're coming back on this show. This has been fun.
Sounds good. I'd love to.
Awesome. Well, folks, we're going to wrap this up. Mike, any last words from you?
Thanks, Scott. Again, I'm enthralled by this information, and I want to dig in more. And thanks, Ethan. And listeners, we appreciate you being part of this, and we'd love to get feedback from you. Ethan, I always get this wrong, so how do people give us feedback?
Yeah, if you'd like to give us some feedback, the best way you can do that actually is leaving us a review. And I'll admit it's pretty self-serving, because actually leaving us a review helps other people find this show, which ultimately we want other people to find this show. That's why we do it. So go to iTunes is usually the best place to do it. Leave us a review. It will really help us out. And then also the feedback's just good for us to have. Also feel free to send us an email at contact@nashconsulting.com if you have topics you'd like for us to cover. If you have suggestions to make this show better, I mean, we're really doing this for you all. So let us know, and that'd be great. Besides that, gotta run. Folks, it's been good. Until next time.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.